Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Mike Brown, Dean of GW's Elliott School of International Affairs, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the campus of the George Washington University in this very special occasion, the annual public lecture by the holder of the Kuwait Professorship in Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs, Ambassador Edward Skip Ghanim, Jr. I'd like to... And the applause will only grow as the evening goes on. I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome to several guests. The Ambassador of Kuwait to the United States, Your Excellency Sheikh Salim Al Sabah. It's a great honor. It's a great honor to welcome you and your wife, Rima, to our university this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge Bob Perry, who's a member of the GW Board of Trustees. It's always great to have representatives of the leadership of the university here as well. Bob, thank you for joining us. On behalf of GW's Elliott School of International Affairs, I'd like to convey our deep appreciation to several extraordinary supporters of this great school and our Middle East Studies programs, starting with His Highness the Emir of Kuwait, who has provided extraordinary generosity and support of the Elliott School's new Institute for Middle East Studies. We'd also like to convey our immense gratitude to the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences for its leadership in creating the Kuwait Professorship in Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs. In addition, we'd like to express our thanks and appreciation to ExxonMobil for its special commitment in support of the Middle East Policy Forum, a high-level series of events here at the Elliott School, and the Middle East Policy Forum is co-sponsoring this evening's lecture. It's great to have Ali Zandon of ExxonMobil with us here this evening. Ali, thanks for joining us. This is indeed a special occasion. Not only is it the annual lecture given by the Kuwait professor at GW, this month marks the 20th anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait. Ambassador Ghanim was the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait during those momentous events. Tonight he will share his reflections and his unique perspective on those historic developments. Before I introduce our speaker, I also want to acknowledge two other guests who have just joined us. The President Emeritus of the George Washington University, the 14th President of this university, Lloyd Elliott. And his daughter, Patricia Elliott Kaufman. It's always a special day at the Elliott School when we have one or two Elliots in the house. So thanks for joining us on this great occasion. It makes it even more special for us. It's now my pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Ambassador Skip Ghanim. Ambassador Ghanim holds a BA and MA from GW's Elliott School of International Affairs. He is one of the most distinguished alumni of this great school. Ambassador Ghanim had an extraordinary 36-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. He was a member of the Senior Foreign Service and held the rank of Career Minister. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Jordan, to Kuwait, and Australia. He was Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations. He also served as Director General of the Foreign Service. Ambassador Ghanim received the Presidential Distinguished Service Award in 2000. Skip Ghanim returned to GW in 2004 as the Shapiro Visiting Professor of International Affairs, our most distinguished visiting professorship. He was appointed to his current position as Kuwait Professor in 2006. He's also the founding director of the Middle East Policy Forum, which he's directed for the past several years, and he's been one of the leaders at the Elliott School's Institute for Middle East Studies, which was launched in 2007 and which has already established itself as a leader in the study of one of the most important regions of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, a great diplomatic representative of the United States, a true friend of Kuwait, and a great citizen of this great university, Ambassador Professor Skip Ganim.
Thank you all very much. It's an honor for me that all of you are here tonight, and I appreciate your welcome, and I hope you're as enthusiastic at the end of my remarks tonight. I just want to say before I start, though, that my own sort of personal greetings to Lloyd Elliott. And I call him Lloyd because, you know, we have actually been friends for 46 years. I didn't think I was old enough to say that, but when I look in the mirror, it's evident. I was president of the student body here at George Washington University when Lloyd came as president. A little bit of a troubled time, but it's a friendship that I have treasured through all the years. And Lloyd, you've always been here to support me each and every time, and I thank you so very, very much for that, really. And I also wanted to just mention to all of you that in the group tonight are several people who are really close to me as well. I mean, we haven't seen some of them in many years, but they were with me when we went into Kuwait, and they're part of my early, and they are our early Kuwait experiences, and I'll be talking about some, but I would mention Nabil Khoury. Nabil, just raise your hand. In the back. Wait, what are you doing way in the back? Well, if you got over to the exhibit, you would have seen Nabil's, it was in the picture there, but he was in public affairs and with me then. And Charlie Chase, Charlie is here, was my security detail chief, and working with him was Peter Ford, who's also here today, and Michael Corbin, who is in an exalted position now at State, but was with me at the beginning back in Kuwait, and full of energy, and I said, piece of dynamite. But you've shown how to channel that too, and Michael, we just appreciate it. And I saved my last personal comment to someone who has been a deep, deep friend, a strong ally, a partner at many times, and that's the ambassador, Sheikh Salem. I'm going to steal the point of my lecture if I keep going on, because we met a long time ago, which I will tell you about, and we've been friends ever since. And Rima, thank you very much for being here, and Diane as well. Nice to have you here. In January, I joined President George Bush at a celebration in Texas, at Texas A&M, which was commemorating the 20th anniversary of the launching of the air war, which led toward the liberation of Kuwait. And Texas A&M produced a very, very nice documentary on the highlights of events from August 2nd, 1990, the date of the Iraqi invasion, up until February 26th, the day of Kuwait's liberation. And I want to share this film with you here at the beginning because it really gives the context for the remarks that I want to make throughout my lecture tonight. So Derek and I are going to take off at the same moment, but we are hoping we land at the same moment at the end, right? Okay.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, following negotiations and promises by Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, not to use force, a powerful Iraqi army invaded its trusting and much weaker neighbor, Kuwait. Within 3 days, 120,000 Iraqi troops with 850 tanks had poured into Kuwait and moved south to threaten Saudi Arabia. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. No one, friend or foe, should doubt our desire for peace, and no one should underestimate our determination to confront aggression. Our objectives in the Persian Gulf are clear. Our goals defined and familiar. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition. These goals are not ours alone. They've been endorsed by the United Nations Security Council 5 times in as many weeks. Most countries share our concern for principle, and many have a stake in the stability of the Persian Gulf. This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world. May I say that I just had a very useful meeting with His Highness the Emir, and I reiterated the total commitment of the United States to the objectives that are enshrined in 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions. We agreed on the desirability that these objectives be realized peacefully. At the same time, we also agreed that all options remained open and that steps needed to be taken right now.
Soldiers of the 18th Airborne Corps, our Commander-in-Chief.
Over the past 4 months, you have launched what history will judge as one of the most important deployments of Allied military power since 1945. And I have come here today to personally thank you. The world is watching. I've spoken with the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, who reported to me on his nearly 7 hours of conversation with the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz. Secretary Baker made it clear that he discerned no evidence whatsoever that Iraq was willing to comply with the international community's demand to withdraw from Kuwait and comply with the United Nations resolutions. Let me emphasize that I have not given up on a peaceful outcome. It's not too late. The choice of peace or war is really Saddam Hussein's to make. Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. Israel is not a participant. Israel is not a combatant. And this man is elected to launch a terroristic attack. When the Soviet Union made such a strong statement, that was very reassuring. And we are in close touch with our coalition partners. And this coalition is not going to fall apart. Now, with remarkable technological advances like the Patriot missile, we can defend against ballistic missile attacks aimed at innocent civilians. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal. We went halfway around the world to do what is moral and just and right. We fought hard, and with others, we won the war. We lifted the yoke of aggression and tyranny from a small country that many Americans had never even heard of, and we asked nothing in return. We're coming home now, proud, confident, heads high. There is much that we must do, at home and abroad, and we will do it. We are Americans. May God bless this great nation, the United States of America. Thank you all very much.
And so it was. At least that was the big picture, looking at it from the exalted heights of the presidency, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. But I want to talk tonight with you about those times from this perspective where I was operating, and talk about the issues that my team faced on the ground as these developments were taking place. This is not just my personal story. It's a story of men and women, of Americans and Kuwaitis who worked together to ensure that we won the peace as well as the war. And this is that story that I want to tell you about tonight. During the fall of 1990, I found a picture of an eagle with wings outstretched high over forest and mountains. And the caption of the picture, the one you see here in front, was "A Time to Soar." And that became our motto. I will never be able to thank sufficiently all the people, each and every person that went in with me on my team during those days, because certainly they soared to heights that were never expected. February 28th, 1991. The sound of the plane's engines filled the cockpit. Looking out over the shoulders of the pilots was a world of sand, and even at the altitude that we were flying, the air was full of this fine silt that the desert winds lift off sand dunes. The Air Force plane in which we were flying had picked us up in Taif, Saudi Arabia, early this morning. We'd been living, or I think better to say camping, with the Kuwaiti government, where they were in exile, and we were there for 7 months with them. And now we were heading northeast across Saudi Arabia, at last on our way to Kuwait. I can tell you we had worked hard through all those months for just this very moment and for what was lying ahead. Arriving in a liberated Kuwait, reopening the embassy, certainly facing an uncertain security situation, rebuilding basic infrastructure, and supporting the government of Kuwait. Well, as the motors of the plane roared and the endless miles of sand passed below, I couldn't help but think about the day and what the day already had been. It was 3 o'clock this morning, and I received a call from Washington, and angrily the person at the department said, "Where are you?" I said, "Taif, you fool," though the last 2 words were inside. I didn't say that. And he said, "Why are you still in Kuwait? In Taif. Kuwait's liberated. You're supposed to be there." And I said, "Well, really? Thank you for calling and telling me." Well, they said, "The secretary wants you in Kuwait today. And you can tell the Kuwaiti government that if they have any more business with Washington, they can go to Kuwait, find you there." Well, Do some words come to your mind, perhaps delicate and diplomatic? Did you think of, no, you didn't really. Well, I didn't either. And I thought, but you know, I'd gotten used to this lack of tact and often blunt sort of instrument approach to problems. Fine, I said. I was certainly willing to leave Taif. I wanted to go to Kuwait. That wasn't the issue. But to leave immediately actually created a very, very huge personal dilemma. Oh, I haven't told you that part of the story. I haven't told you about my arrival in Taif in August when I first met the late Emir Sheikh Jaber. I do remember arriving at the Sheraton Hotel where the Emir and his government were located, and I was immediately taken aback by the huge crowd of Kuwaitis who were there, all in their white thobes, and every last one of them looking at me. The car door opened, and a young Kuwaiti, who I later learned was Sheikh Salam Abdullah al-Sabah, who is currently the ambassador here. It was he who greeted me that evening and walked me through the crowd, through this atrium, the hotel, to the elevator. And on every face there was a combination of anticipation and certainly desperation, a searching for hope, a reassurance that they were going to be able to go home soon. I quickly realized what a huge gap existed between their expectations of going home and the timeline that I knew was likely to be. But I digress. It was my meeting with the Emir that I was trying to tell you about. And it is that meeting that haunts me as I got that call this morning from Washington. Because my written instructions when I arrived that day in Taif to meet the Emir was that I was ordered to tell him that the president had promised to liberate Kuwait, that he was supposed to get on TV and bolster the morale of the Kuwaiti communities around the region. And I'd struggled on the entire plane ride out to Taif with just how I would do that. I mean, after all, the Emir was, as I calculated, about 60-something. I was 45. He'd been Emir for 13 years. I hadn't even been sworn in as ambassador. So as you see, I was trying to struggle to see how I would do it. The Emir, he received me very, very kindly, very, very generously, and had profound words of thanks immediately for the promise that the president had made to liberate Kuwait. Check, one of my points taken care of without any effort. But I then started talking, and I said, but the president needs your help. He's asking that you address your people, urge them to believe and to persevere. My words, right? But I could tell that the Iraqi invasion and the loss of his country had been devastating on him personally. He'd visited Iraq only a year before as a guest of Saddam Hussein and been given the highest award that the Iraqis can give a foreign dignitary. And then, I'm sure and know the Emir felt betrayed. He certainly, I would imagine, felt humiliated. And as I spoke, the Emir really just looked at me with a very penetrating stare. It was one of those moments, and there were many during these months, I would tell you, when I prayed to God to tell me what to do, and he did. I looked down the papers I was holding in my lap, and I set them down on the couch next to me, and I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, Your Highness, you are going home to Kuwait, and I'm going with you, and I'll be there one step behind you. And when we get there, I'll give you my credentials as ambassador. The Emir nodded, and I detected a little flash in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Now, there was only one other person in the room that night. It was Sheikh Nasser Mohammed, then Minister of Court, and currently the Prime Minister of Kuwait. And I soon learned, after the meeting, that word had spread throughout this hotel that I had placed my fate with theirs. That I was obviously so confident that we were going to Kuwait that I was willing not to be an ambassador until we got there. It was the beginning of a bonding that proved so critically important in the months ahead. But now you understand my dilemma. My orders meant breaking my promise to the Emir. I had to work to build that relationship, and I didn't want to destroy it. I knew I needed to see the Emir. I know I wanted his, you might say blessings, but at least his understanding. And when I saw him, I guess I need not have worried, because his response was, Skip, those are your instructions. You should go. And I will be there as soon as the security situation permits. You know, back in the plane, the motors are droning on, and we passed over Riyadh at this point, and there was chatter, you know, over the radio, and a worried glance by the pilot in my direction. More chatter. And taking off the headphones, the pilot turned to me and he said, "Well, we're not going to Kuwait today." What? He said, "Yeah," he said, "it seems that the oil fire smoke has completely enveloped the airport and you can't land. There are no ways of landing except visual. So we're going to have to go to Dhahran or Dammam, near Dammam." Oh boy, I thought, this is going to be a very difficult call to the secretary to say that I'm not in Kuwait today, like he said this morning. But I have to tell you, the worst problem I had when we landed in Dhahran wasn't the call to the secretary. It was convincing the commo guys on the tarmac that I was really serious about calling the Secretary of State. I can tell you the conversation was very funny. "Oh, he wants to call the Secretary of State. Who are you?" Well, some of my security, I think, actually stepped in thinking it was the right thing to do. And anyway, I got through to the secretary. And he said something along these lines, "You know, Skip, there's some things you just can't change." So he was at least understanding. So off we went. We went to spend the night with our consul general there. And the day ended on a very humorous note. Before dinner, we were all sitting in the living room. We were all talking, and blaring behind us, of course, was CNN News, as it was every day of our lives. And suddenly there flashed on the screen an Army helicopter sweeping in over the embassy compound, and a rope dropped from the helicopter and onto the roof and the Marine House, and figures started shimmering down the rope. And the announcer said, "Look, and here comes the American ambassador returning to his embassy." Well, you did exactly what the room did that night. It burst into laughter. I pinched myself to make sure I was on the couch and not on some. And another call to the Department of State and to my family to say, "Look, I do a lot of things really well, but going down ropes is not one of them." Well, March 1, 1991, we're flying toward Kuwait. From my seat behind the pilots, I could see the black mass of smoke covering the earth ahead. A large smoke plume carried by the wind stretched to my right as far down the Persian Gulf as you could see. Hundreds of oil wells burning, smoke, the ground itself aflame with oil spills, and then suddenly the airport in front of us. I remember those first sights. The control tower blackened, in fact, still smoking. Most of the buildings lay in ruin, hangar completely flattened. And there was a skeleton of this British airplane that had been lured into the airport the morning of the invasion. It lay eerily on the tarmac with its tail sticking up in the air, declaring its pedigree. The British ambassador, by the way, was not happy with this publicity. The four engines lying on the tarmac where they'd fallen off the wings, the nose bent forward, and the charged seats of all of, the passenger seats in rows. It made it look like the skeleton of a fish. Well, most of my team piled into 2 vehicles to drive to the embassy, but my security detail and the military were concerned about ongoing shooting still in the city, and they insisted that I go by helicopter. The pilot took the helicopter out over the waterway, away from the ground fire, and up the coast. And along the entire coast, you could see damage, destruction. We passed over burning oil facilities, and all along the coast were abandoned trenches, artillery emplacements. They were expecting an amphibious landing, which was a trick that Schwarzkopf had concocted. But there were hundreds of burning vehicles, military and civilian, along the way. Well, we swooped in high over the embassy and then dropped precipitously to the parking lot inside the embassy compound. And there, on the ground, we were greeted by U.S. Army Special Forces who had secured the compound for us and for our return. Parenthesis. There's a story here, which I won't tell at this moment in time, but it's worth hearing at some point. Going on. I noticed a large crowd inside the compound as we made our way toward the flagpole, and to that moment that would be the highlight, one of the highlights of my life. I took the American flag that my predecessor, Ambassador Nathaniel Howell, had brought out of Kuwait when he left, and raised it yet again over our embassy. We were back, and nothing so underscored our success in my mind than that flag flying once again over our embassy in the liberated Kuwait. Meanwhile, outside the compound, on the highway along the sea, there was a steady parade of vehicles of all sorts, packed with people shouting and laughing, with all of them with flags, as you see here, of the U.S., of Kuwait, of all the coalition countries. They made the moment grander with their passion and their celebration. Frankly, it was like the kind of celebration that we've seen in recent weeks in Cairo and Tahrir Square. And the celebration went on for days, and not without a little bit of concern, because you see the revelers enjoyed shooting into the air and seeming to have forgotten the law of gravity and that things going up come down. And yeah, I checked out with my security detail here earlier, and the story I remembered is true, so I'm changing my text to say, yes, one of the bullets came down in my dining room while we were sitting at the dining room table, and it actually went between the legs of one of our people. Anyway, no one laughed at that moment. It wasn't quite like Tehran with the TV. But there you go. Well, the celebrations could go on throughout the city, but the reality of what we faced was immediately upon us. As I said, winning the battle and winning the peace are two different things, and we learned that sadly in Iraq. The Iraqis had destroyed much in Kuwait: banks, commercial establishments, communication infrastructure like the satellite dish. Virtually all government buildings were damaged, many severely. There was no electricity. There was no water. Some hospitals continued to function due to the dedication, really, of the Kuwaiti doctors and volunteers. But the facilities lacked medicine and lacked even the basic equipment because it all had been looted. On the security side, Washington feared there might be incidents or violence that might embarrass us or discredit the success that both we and the Kuwaitis had achieved. So I would point to three immediate challenges. One was maintaining order and avoiding the random acts of any retaliation or retribution that might have occurred. The second was restoring the infrastructure and services. And third was reestablishing the government of Kuwait in its country. There was a longer-term goal, the restoration of the Kuwaiti National Assembly, the parliament, but I'll get to that a bit later. My first and foremost concern was the possibility of violence, specifically the possibility of Kuwaiti retaliation, either on Iraqi troops who found themselves abandoned due to the rapid retreat of the Iraqi forces, or against, to be honest, the remnants of the Palestinian community. Just as a way of background, the Kuwaitis were incensed, and had a right to be, when Arafat sided with Saddam Hussein. And this was especially galling because Kuwait had been a host for a very large Palestinian community for years. I knew we had to move fast. The international press was everywhere. Any ugly incident would have immediately received global coverage, and the light came on. That was the answer. Use the press, and specifically CNN. Because anyone with a satellite dish and a generator in Kuwait had CNN on to find out what was happening in their own country. So Off we went to hospitals, where I visited Iraqi troops who were patients there and sick and injured Kuwaitis. I knew that if we were seen dealing with Iraqi POWs in the manner in which I was doing it, it would send a message to all people in the country just how we intended things to develop. And I'll be very honest with you, I knew too that it's very much harder to disappear someone who's been seen alive on television. In the evening, word came of trouble in a neighborhood traditionally populated by Palestinians, and off we went again, showing up unexpectedly and serving as a buffer between an angry crowd and a very scared community. Our presence, and to be honest, the profile that I had as a result of much activity in those 7 months, altered the situation and changed the tone. Another night, several members of my team reported that there was a site where individuals were being held and abused. I went to see the Crown Prince, Sheikh Saad, who was also the Prime Minister, who was in Kuwait, and the person with whom I worked on a daily basis. I told him what was happening. He said it wasn't true. I said, Your Highness, in all the months we've been together, have I ever lied to you? He looked at me and he said, I want you here tomorrow night at 9 o'clock and I'll tell you what I've done. I said, no, I won't be here tomorrow at 9 o'clock. And I said, because if you tell me you're going to do it, you'll do it. And I don't need to be here to prove it. Actually, I went back an hour later at like 10 o'clock the next night. He'd done it. I already knew that from my people, because this was not the policy of the government. This was not the way they intended to approach it. And I'm going to make a quick comment here. When I talk about concern about retribution, I'm talking about random and completely uncontrollable mob or groups, not anything that the government of Kuwait wanted. In fact, quite the opposite. They did not want anything that would happen that would, in fact, diminish the moment. So we managed to avoid and certainly minimize the violence. It was much less than we expected. But restoring the infrastructure and services was a huge challenge, given the massive destruction in the occupation period. But we were ready. You saw earlier that the Emir had visited President Bush in Washington in September. I was there. The President asked the Emir if there was anything that he could do for the Emir. And the Emir had only one request. Can you help us plan for the rebuilding of Kuwait and for taking care of my people after liberation? The President responded immediately, of course we can. And the President confided in me later how touched he was that the Emir didn't ask him for a promise to liberate Kuwait, because, as the President assumed correctly, the Emir believed that. But the President was touched that the Emir was thinking about his people and about the future. The presidential pledge led to the call-up of an Army Civil Affairs unit of the 352nd Civil Affairs Command. Colonel Randy Elliott, Randy, I didn't mention you at the beginning deliberately, where are you? Right here. Who headed that team. Randy and his team worked with Kuwaiti counterparts in what was called the Kuwait Task Force. And in the months from then until the military action, this group planned for every possible contingency that they could think about. For example, assumption that there would be no water. So a contract brought a fleet of 600 Turkish water trucks all the way across the Middle East to a holding zone in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, ready to establish a convoy of trucks to take water into Kuwait. Field hospitals were purchased and pre-positioned. 40 Arabic-speaking doctors were hired and moved to a hotel in Cairo, waiting to be flown into liberated Kuwait to provide medical assistance. The Americans and the Kuwaitis bonded as brothers. And when we entered Kuwait, without a question, they were the backbone of our operations to deal with the many issues that we faced at that time. As I watched the chaos in Iraq in 2003, I have to tell you, I cried a little bit. We'd planned once for the day after the end of military fighting, and we could have planned again. We have incredible talent. We even had a template. It wasn't very old, but it wasn't used. Well, in those days in Kuwait, I often felt like the mayor. I never thought I would know so much about sewage systems and power plants. I can tell you that there was certainly no chapter in my diplomatic training manual on how to unclog sewers and rebuild a burnt-out power plant. But you know, I wasn't the mayor. I wasn't a minister or a general or a prince. I may have had the best team in the world to address the problems and the backup of the best military in the field, but it was the Kuwaiti government and the Kuwaiti people for whom we'd liberated the country. And it was their country, and as the president said, it was their destiny. And our entire team was determined to see that the Kuwaitis were out in front and were engaged. And that was the third challenge. Let me give you an example. Day after day, we worked to restore power in Kuwait, and day after day, we were frustrated as one after another of our efforts failed. The population grew angrier by the day, and criticism mounted, and I resorted once again to my TV gambit and CNN. Accompanying the Minister of Electricity, and as I said, with a CNN crew in tow, we toured the burnout remains of the main power plant. It was dark, soot everywhere, smelt awful of burnt wires, twisted metal. It was like a scene out of hell, actually. But it was quite evident that the plant was not going to operate for some time. And that night, when I was out doing my thing, visiting Kuwaitis as I did every night, I heard no criticism whatsoever, just astonishment and awe at the destruction and the incredible task that we faced. Well, there are many stories to tell as I moved around Kuwait in those first few weeks, but there's no story that matches that of the fires in the oil fields. Iraqis had placed charges on virtually all wellheads. And in the days prior to our military intervention into Kuwait, they ignited those wells, over 700. I already described how it looked from the air, but there was nothing compared to the scene on the ground. Entering the burning oil fields as I did activated every single human sense. You felt the heat. You could smell the burning oil. You saw the raging flames. You heard the roar of the oil spewing up out of the earth. And horrifyingly, you could feel the earth you were standing on pulsating and shaking as if the entire planet was coming unplugged. Millions of barrels of oil were flung into the air, actually 6 million a day. And they were pooling in hollows and in ditches, most of which were on fire. And people predicted that it would take years to control the wellheads. And it took less than 6 months, due very significantly to American companies and American teams working side by side with the Kuwaitis. I mentioned earlier the Kuwait National Assembly, the parliament. Major issue for both the U.S. and Kuwait was indeed the future of the National Assembly. American critics of Bush's commitment to liberate Kuwait often attacked him for going to war to restore a monarchy. The National Assembly had been suspended in 1986. We made clear to the Kuwaitis that the ability of the president to respond to future security threats was directly related to the American public perception of Kuwait's commitment to restore representative government. But in fact, it wasn't us in the end. It was the Kuwaitis themselves at a conference in Jeddah during the occupation that made clear to their government that they wanted parliament restored. And the al-Sabah family had agreed. And elections were held 1.5 years after liberation, and parliament has been in place ever since. I think we've all been moved by the very amazing developments in Egypt the past few weeks, as we've seen Egyptians demanding an open and representative system. And as I watched that, I thought back to 20 years ago to Kuwait and to the Kuwaiti people asking and talking to their own government for the restoration of their parliament, and noted the big difference was the dialogue and the family that was responsive, and that the institutions that were established in Kuwait's constitution from 1962 were reestablished after liberation. Let me conclude with just 3 very quick observations. First and foremost, I think I would tell you that power and influence are best exercised with humility and a constant awareness of who you are and who you aren't. My position or status at the time was undisputed. There was no question about who I was and what my capabilities were, or even that of the civil affairs team and my Foreign Service colleagues. There wasn't any need to emphasize that. And we always stressed as we did our work the team approach, the partnership, and we found that in doing so our influence only grew as a consequence. And I think that's a good lesson in life. Secondly, I would say that our success was very much a consequence of the bonds and ties of respect and trust that developed between American colleagues and our Kuwaiti counterparts. And you know, those 2 words, colleagues and counterparts, do not come close to describing the very close feelings of friendship and camaraderie that actually did develop between us. And to this day, since some of you in the room have been able to go to Kuwait, you would find that the Kuwaitis still view President Bush as Kuwait's liberator. And the feeling in Kuwait toward America today, 20 years after liberation, remains one of gratitude, appreciation, and thanks. And my final thought is that the liberation of Kuwait truly demonstrates what the United States can do. We built an international coalition. We gained international support through UN resolutions. We fielded a professional military with all the capabilities it needed to win. And we used the talent and skills of American professionals to plan and to implement the reconstruction of a country. We can do it. Truly, I would say to you, this moment in time was indeed a time to soar, and soar we did. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very generous of you. I would be happy to spend some time taking questions. We have 2 microphones, one here and I think one over there. So if you are interested in asking a question, if you would just step up or raise your hand and they'll bring the microphone to you. I'd be happy to respond to anything I talked about, didn't talk about, or as all of my friends in the room have told me, you're not going to get away without talking about what's going on in the region today.
Ambassador Green, you alluded to a story when you were standing in front of the helicopter, and I would like you to tell that story.
Thank you. I have to do it far more quickly than it deserves, but it turns out that the Marine Corps didn't follow orders, the group coming up the coast. They were told to stop at the 5th Ring Road outside because we were going to let the Kuwaitis go into Kuwait first, right? But seeing nobody in front of them, Marines do what Marines do. Straight on. They suddenly found themselves at the American Embassy. And they pulled up to the wall, looked over the wall, and reported back that it looked fine. It didn't look like anything had happened. You say, well, what's the story here? Well, the Army Special Forces had the responsibility and were given the task to take the embassy for me, right? The colonel in charge was livid that the Marines had done him in, stolen his moment of thunder. He then announced to all the press that was located in the hotel next to the embassy to be on their balconies the next day at a certain time. They were coming in, and they were going to take the embassy, and there'd be great photos. You saw part of that with the helicopter, right? Only when they landed, they wanted to do it big, so they went around the back of the embassy with an acetylene torch to cut the metal on the windows. They wouldn't use the front door because, of course, the Iraqis must have booby-trapped them, right? So the torch breaks the glass and sets the curtain on fire inside. To put out the fire so that the embassy doesn't burn down, they placed a charge against the wall of the Deputy Chief of Missions office and blew a hole to be able to get in. But anyone who knows anything about explosives know that a concussion will take the course of least resistance, which was to go the entire length of the embassy building, hit the other wall at the other end, and ricochet all the way back, blowing out every bit of the ceilings in all the offices, and breaking all of the trusses in the ceiling, right? And a few other things to make the story not go on long. So when I arrived, the embassy was not usable. And it had nothing to do with the Iraqis. And I can only tell you, because I realize I'm in an academic world where you do footnotes and you attribute, so I can tell you that not only do I know this from my firsthand experience, but an Army publication, do you all remember which one it was by chance? Printed a story about a month and a half later, which is a lot along the lines, with a bit more detail actually about what they did. They destroyed everything. But they saved it. They saved it. Sir.
Ambassador, there are accounts that Saddam Hussein was much closer to developing weapons of mass destruction just prior to the invasion of Kuwait and might have succeeded if he had ignored Kuwait altogether. Are you in a position to comment on this?
Well, yes, I can. First of all, we do know, as a result of post-Gulf War inspections inside Iraq, that they were much further along in the nuclear program than we had thought. There are people who sit around trying to figure out why Saddam did some things and didn't do others, and that's one of them. Why, if you were moving ahead and having such success, would you then act? I think he was motivated in a large part by an economic situation internally in the country, and he feared an eruption from the population and maybe even the coups from the military because of that economic situation. That's my own view of it. But indeed, there's a story that comes to mind, which I'll tell, and Baker tells this story. He was, with Tariq Aziz, you saw that mentioned in the film, in Geneva, which was the last effort to prove to everyone that we were willing to try a peaceful approach. And it was not a fruitful meeting at all. But in that course of that meeting, Baker says that he told Tariq Aziz, I'll tell you right now, if you use weapons of mass destruction against our troops, we will use everything we have in our arsenal, and you can tell your president that. Now, people quickly jumped to the conclusion that he meant even nuclear weapons. And the government didn't even repudiate that. It never really said that's not what we meant. It let it fester. And Baker said down in Texas about a month ago, I'm vindicated because when they interrogated Tariq Aziz, and they asked Tariq Aziz, why didn't you use chemical and biological weapons, particularly against, he said, don't you remember what Baker said to me in Geneva? And he made explicit reference to the fact they feared to use nuclear weapons. So anyway, another question?
Well, while we're recounting interesting stories, could you tell the incubator baby story?
Oh, someone had to remember that. What he's referring to is that there was a hearing before the House committee at one point in which there were witnesses. And one of the witnesses spoke about the Iraqis in looting, this goes back into the period of your occupation, in looting even the incubators with babies in them, tossing the babies onto the floor just to get the incubators to take back to Iraq. And this became a very controversial remark because it turned out that that the person who was making it was related to the family, and the question was whether she had actually seen it or been there. And what I can tell you from traveling around in Kuwait after liberation in those first few weeks, I did visit a couple of hospitals in which the nurses told me that that actually had happened. Not quite the same way the story was told at the hearing, but that there had been babies in incubators thrown on the floor by the Iraqis to be able to take the incubators away. Yes, ma'am. Did I see a hand back up here? I'll come up that way next.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Aisha Al-Nisif. I'm Kuwaiti and a law student here in George Washington. I just want to say thank you so much. I don't have a question, but I have a couple of quotes and anecdotes that I found them from your beautiful library here that talks about Kuwait and the history of Kuwait. So I would like to share them with the audience.
If you can do it briefly.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just want to say that the liberation of Kuwait and how we were able to just restructure the country was in connection with the American and also with the Kuwaiti people. There are a quote by Captain Hennell, who in 1841, he mentioned that they, when they were planning to he mentioned about like Kuwaiti peoples, and he were like British resident in the Gulf, and he said the energy and courage of the people who are closely united and free from feuds and factions render them respected and feared by all other maritime tribes. And also I would like to add the special relationship between Kuwaitis and their government is very special. And once, a long time ago in 1859, Louis Billy, a British resident, he met Sheikh Sabah II, and he told him about an anecdote when his father, Sheikh Jabir, before he died, what he told him. And he mentioned that my father called me and said, I shall soon die. I have made no fortune and can leave you no money, but I have made many true friends. Grapple them. While other states around the Gulf have fallen off from injustice and ill government, mine has gone on increasing. So I just want to say that the Kuwaitis and the special relationship will stand hopefully forever. Thank you very much.
Inshallah, inshallah. Thank you. Back up here, there were some questions.
Ambassador Ghanem, it's always a pleasure to get your insights into Kuwait. Since you opened up the forum for discussion about what's happening in the Middle East, I was wondering if you could give us some insights about the Twitter revolution happening in the Middle East and what the role for Kuwait may play as the events progress in the region.
Well, what is really clear, and it's, I think, obvious and well covered in the press, is that the whole younger generation and the Twitter and the communications that goes along with Facebook and all these others has opened up a connectivity amongst people that has just simply never existed before. And the stark contrast with merely 10 or 20 years ago, when in fact governments could still control access to information. It began to crumble, of course, with satellite dishes, but with the Twitter and the Facebook and others, the communication link between people of like mind is very simple, and obviously was one that precipitated the kind of organization and reaction that we saw in Egypt. And it's true all over the region. It's true all over the world, but it is very, very true in the region. Kuwait, well, I don't myself see Kuwait in the forefront of that. It's a very modern country. Everyone there has access to all of these structures to use and network as they do. But Kuwait is very different from Egypt, and that was some of what you were saying. One of the things, and I'll go on, it's not quite your question, but I'd like to answer it anyway, because people are asking now, well, isn't this going to ripple all over, and what about, they ask me about the countries I know, Jordan, and then Kuwait. And I say, you know, if you know Kuwait, it has an obstreperous parliament, historically famous for that. They have attacked ministers almost any year that you look on a calendar. They write in more than 40 newspapers about anything that they want to, usually about government corruption and government this and this, that, and the other. It's a fairly open society. And I will add just one other one, realizing this might be a new concept for some of you, and that's the whole social structure of the Diwaniyah. A Diwaniyah is a gathering in homes, which many of the families have, in which people move around at night. Which I told you, I moved around a lot. You go from one place to another, you visit, you drink coffee, you talk, you gossip, you pass on, you pick up stuff to take to the next one to gossip and pass on. But in those settings, they'll just, you know, did you hear what the minister said? It's wide open kind of criticism. And so what I'm really saying is there's an escape valve. It's not an oppressive situation in which people who are opposed to government and have criticism of government can't express themselves. And that makes a big difference in a body politic, very big difference. We'll take one more here, and then I'll come back over here.
Thank you. If I recall correctly, after the war, there was a number of Iraqi prisoners that the military captured. Can you comment on the process briefly about repatriating those soldiers back to Iraq after the war?
That's a very good question, and it's a complicated one. Some of you who were following it at the time will remember that one of the biggest problems the United States military had were the thousands, I should say tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers who were trying to surrender, who were coming toward American forces, but not to fight them, with their hands on their heads to just give up. And the American military found that one of their biggest obstacles was to find a place to put them and just hold them so that the battle could go on forward. And those that were in Kuwait and were captured there were repatriated to Iraq rather quickly. There were a whole group of Iraqis, though, that were in Saudi Arabia or ended up being taken there and ended up in a camp in Arar. And their repatriation became very complicated because some of them did not want to go back to Iraq because of the fear of what would happen to them. And the Saudis, honestly, didn't really want to absorb them. And that particular group was one that did not get resolved very quickly. So, over here was one question.
Ambassador Ghanim, what were your lessons learned from working with the Kuwaiti government that you think could be applied broadly in the Middle East to improving or maintaining a positive relationship with Arab governments?
Well, the first thing I would say is the one I actually spoke to even with my examples, which is that you need to build very close personal relationships with the governments in that area, the people in that area. And I will tell you that one of my objectives in how I did my job was that I would reach out to virtually every segment of society in the country so that they had an encounter with me. They knew me, they could say they'd seen me. They might yell at me, that was okay. And that by doing that, I created a credibility for myself and my government. And I think that proved very valuable and very helpful over a period of time. And to this day, when I go back, I still feel those relationships that I built in those days. And I think, again, the experience that many of the Kuwaitis and government had with our civil affairs unit were a bonding experience, and it was one in which, well, if you stop and go back one step, I could tell you that Kuwait and the United States had not been the closest of friends, allies. No, allies, we never would have used that word, historically. But given the Iraq-Iran war and the tankers that we reflagged and the protection we gave, began to build a relationship. And then with the invasion and the complete absorption of the coalition led by the United States, with the Kuwaitis saying if it had not been for the United States, we would not be free, that you got a sense within the community of what Americans could really do as friends, as bonding. And that's what I meant earlier when I said it persists. And so it's honesty, it's sincerity, it's being genuine with people. And when we had disagreements, we expressed them, but I think in a way that was respectful. I would tell you that in my own Foreign Service career, and I think my colleagues here tonight would probably tell you they've had the same experience, we sometimes wonder what's behind U.S. government statements and actions that don't seem really to personify who we are as a people. I mentioned sometimes the language of instructions against, I wouldn't carry them out that way, and I'm not sure that they thought I would, but the point of the matter is I often wonder, would I do that if I was being told to do that to my neighbor out where I live in Potomac? Would I really like the relationship I would then have with the neighbor because of what I just said or did and the way I did it? And the answer is absolutely not. So why should it be that different, between governments? Well, it's bureaucracies, and it's the impersonal nature of what can happen in life. So you'll always hear me, whenever I talk and whenever I do things, really stress the personal touch, the personal involvement, every place that we go. That is what builds something solid. It's a long answer, sorry. I feel strongly about that. One more question. One second, she's got the microphone there. I think I'll make this the last question.
I'd like to thank you for your time tonight, for coming to speak with all of us, and I had one question. You mentioned the opportunity to reach new heights in situations like you saw in Kuwait, and the coalition and friendship that you were able to build in your capacity as ambassador. What would you say that the average or American citizen, someone who is not working in a diplomatic capacity, can do to support people's yearning to be free in whatever country in the Middle East or globally? What can we do to support and foster those friendships?
That's a very good question, and I think it goes back to one that I got here earlier about Twitter. The point of the matter is now you can go right out here in the hall and connect with people in Tahrir Square. And for many of them, they look for support, particularly from Americans, because we proclaim anyway our beliefs in democracy and human rights and the things that they were asking for. So, I mean, that's just one thing that's obvious. I mean, just simply being in communication and talking and being able to provide support. There are organizations that work in countries, non-governmental organizations in particular, that try to help people move in that direction, see themselves, and try to give them a sense of empowerment and encouragement. I happen to be a friend of Tawakkul, the woman who you may see in the news about Yemen. She's someone that I've gotten to know through the years. She is a terrific individual, a real fighter in a nonviolent way for what she believes in, and she's undaunted. But she expresses in private to me, the need to know that there are other people out there who believe she's doing right and give her just encouragement. And I've done that myself, as have some other people that I know who've gotten to know her and worked with her. So that's at least one suggestion. Well, thank you all very much.
Well, Skip, you touched on a lot of important issues this evening. One of them is that sometimes things don't work out, and sometimes they do. Success is possible. And one of the reasons for that is, you touched on a couple of times, just has to do with having the right people in the right place at the right time and making connections. Even with modern technology, it still comes back to people getting to know people and making the right decisions in the right way. And you really symbolize that more than anyone I know. And I think for the people of Kuwait, the people of America, and at that particular juncture in history, having the right man at the right place at the right time made a huge difference in explaining why things turned out as well as they did. So on behalf of everyone here this evening, thanks not just for your lecture tonight, but for being the right man in the right place at the right time at that moment in history. Skip, thanks very much.